Let's look at two more examples of using the quadratic formula. First thing to check, remember, is that it equals 0. And by it, I mean a second degree polynomial. So that's what we mean by quadratic, is that x is being squared. And so we have a formula where x is squared and we're equal to 0, so that means we can use the quadratic formula. What are the values of a, b, and c? Remember, a is the coefficient on x squared. So in our case, a is 8. B is the coefficient on x. In this case, it's a -2. And c is the constant term. So in this case, it's -1. It is important to keep the negative signs with those numbers. Then it says use the quadratic formula. So we need to work on getting that memorized. The quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So then we use our a, b, and c in this formula. Since b is negative, the opposite of b is going to be a +2 plus or minus the square root. I would suggest always doing b squared in your head if possible, especially when it's a negative. You don't need to use a calculator for that. -2 squared makes a +4. Minus 4 times 8 times -1. All over 2 times 8. Now, when you might want to use a calculator is just to put this in the stuff that's under the radicand. So let's do that. You might not need to in this problem, but it doesn't hurt to check. So it's 4 minus 4 times 8 times -1. Make sure that that -1 gets typed in with this negative button down here. And I get 36. Now I will tell you that one of the mistakes I see people making most often is forgetting that a negative times a negative makes this positive. So if you are doing it more by hand rather than the calculator, make sure that you catch that 2 negatives make this a positive. So this then becomes 2 plus or minus the square root of 36 all over 16. The square root of 36 simplifies really nicely. So now this is 2 plus or minus 6 over 16. Right, because square root of 36 is just 6. This gives us two different answers. One where it's 2 plus 6 over 16, or 8 over 16, which is 1/2. And the other where it's 2 minus 6 over 16, which is -4 over 16, or -1/4. So those are our solutions, 1/2 and -1/4. We want to simplify them as much as possible. So if the square root simplifies, we should be simplifying the square root and getting it down to as much as we can, simplified. Let's check that, because these are going to be easier to check, especially if I use them as decimals, 0.5 and -0.25. In this case, that's not an approximation because those are the exact values of those fractions. Decimals are easier to plug into the calculator. So I'm going to use the original equation here and just plug in those x values. So let's start with x equals 0.5. It's 8 times 0.5 squared minus 2 times 0.5 minus 1. And I want to know, does that equal 0? For checking, all you got to do is type in the calculator. 8 times 0.5 squared minus 2 times 0.5 minus 1 equals. That looks like 0, so that means I did it right. Let's check the other value. X is -0.25. It's a little trickier to type in a negative, especially on these more basic calculators, but we can still handle it. We just gotta make sure to use that negative button at the bottom. So I use the original equation, and we're plugging in our other x value that we found as a solution. 8 times 0.25 negative, then squared, minus 2 times 0.25 negative, minus 1 equals. Looks like 0. So that means it checked out. And both of our solutions do work in the original equation. And that's what the quadratic formula does for us. It finds x values that make the equation true. Let's do it again. X squared plus 7x plus 2. First, identify a, b, and c. Now in this case, there is no visible coefficient on the x squared, but that just means it's being multiplied by 1. So a is 1. B is 7, the coefficient on x, and the constant term is plus 2. All right, let's try it with the quadratic formula. I always like to write the formula out. It also helps me memorize it to keep writing it out. Make sure I get it down. All right, first up is opposite of b. Opposite of b is negative 7 plus or minus the square root. Square b, 7 squared I know is 49, minus 4 times 1 times 2. All over 2 times 1. Hopefully we're sort of getting this idea. Let's keep going. Next is to put the stuff that's inside the square root into the calculator. 49 minus 8. I just know that 4 times 2 is 8. That's 41. So I get negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 41 all over 2. Right, after you figure out what the inside of the square root simplifies to, the next step is to simplify the square root. Look for perfect squares. So check if 9 goes into 41, if 16 goes into 41, or if 25 goes into 41. And they don't. So that means that we're done. There are no perfect squares that go into 41, so we are fully simplified. Negative 7 plus square root of 41 over 2, and negative 7 minus square root of 41 over 2 are our two solutions. If you put these in your calculator, you can get an approximation for the answer, and that would help you check if you wanted to.